Hi everyone, Rukshan here, and thanks for joining me for this conversation with David Limbrick. I'm coming to you from a nightclub in the basement here, and this is the Parliament in Exile. So, David, for those watching, can you explain to them what Parliament in Exile exactly is?
As you may be aware, Parliament put through a motion recently to suspend members of its own Parliament, which people who refuse to hand over their vaccination certificates. So I've said many times publicly that I actually am vaccinated, but I refused to hand over my certificate because I thought that the government dictating medical procedures required to be a democratic representative was a step too far, and we had to show some sort of dissent to that, which is why we're here. So that we're at the Chase Lounge, which the proprietors very kindly allowed us to use for the purposes of Parliament, because he's not allowed to open much at the moment. He can't run a business, can't run a nightclub at the moment. And so, yeah, we've set up here. We've got a projector screen with you can see the Parliament running. We've got our computers and an internet connection, and we can pretty much do most stuff that we would do normally in Parliament, except for with a few exceptions. And the biggest exception, of course, is voting. We can't actually vote because of constitutional issues around that.
You also introduced a motion today, is that correct?
Yeah, so one of the things that we tried to do today was to reopen there's a Parliamentary Accounts and Estimates Committee, reopen an inquiry into the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So last year there was two of these inquiries looking at the government's response. I was involved in it. I'm a member of that committee. And the committee tabled its last report in February. And of course, since February, there's been a lot of things happen. Since then, we've had increasing sort of strictness and in lots of cases, severe, violence at protests and things like this, where we've seen, police open fire on protesters, and I know that Russian's seen more of that than anyone, and things like vaccine mandates, which triggered a lot of that, passports, where you can get refused entry into shops and things like this, and it seemed important to me to look at what's happened in that intervening period and examine it in detail. Yeah.
So, what was the result of trying to get that reopened? I guess what happened?
Yeah. So the government's argument was that, oh well, we have lots of transparency already, and because we do media release, we do media presses every day, which I totally reject. I don't think that this one-way communication from the government through the media is very in-depth at all. You don't get serious experts and stuff that come up from panels. You don't, and one of the big things that you can do in an inquiry is organisations and members of the public can put in their own submissions to these inquiries, and then they can be considered and incorporated as part of the report. And that certainly doesn't happen, when the Premier and a few of the bureaucrats are standing there talking to the media. That certainly doesn't happen. So what ended up happening in the end is everyone in the chamber supported it, except for the government and Andy Medic from the Animal Justice Party. And so it was tied 16 all, which meant that it didn't pass because it needed a majority. So that's really unfortunate. So, there was 3 votes. We raised our hand, signalling that we wanted to support it, but we weren't allowed to. So it didn't pass, only barely. And most, even Fiona Patten and the Greens supported it. They actually spoke in support of opening the inquiry, to their credit. I know that Sam Hibbins from the Greens, who's also a member of the committee, and I've worked with him, he's been very supportive of reopening the inquiry, I think, and he's actually takes it seriously, I think. So like I do. So yeah, I think they wanted to reopen it as well to look at some of these issues.
Yeah, and did Andy Medic from the Animal Justice Party give a reason?
He didn't speak on it.
Didn't
I don't
speak
think.
on it. Okay.
No, didn't speak on it.
No worries. And so, I guess for the layman that's watching out there, does that mean that some of these issues will not be addressed ever, or does it mean it will be addressed in a different forum at a different time?
Look, I don't know. I mean, you know,
Because like some of the scenes that we saw, like people being shot by police with these rubber bullets, things like this,
yeah.
you would think that the politicians and people in leadership would be discussing these matters, right? To see whether that was justified, or whether, you know, next time that we are faced with a certain situation, the response would be any different. Isn't that kind of the reason that we have these kind of these committees to look into these things? So
That's exactly what I thought. I mean, I'm I'm not. My motivation isn't to, you know, attribute blame or anything like that. I'm hoping that we can look at the response that happened and find, you know, if there were problems and things like this, then we can understand what caused those problems and maybe fix them so that they don't happen again. Because, you know, I was very upset and distressed, as were many Victorians, by the police response to many of these protests. I've said for many times that I think that the role of the police in these matters should be, you know, a harm minimisation approach to facilitate protests, acknowledging that risks exist and that there's ways that they could facilitate it to lower risk, you know, like providing advice on how to socially distance and mask wearing and that sort of thing, and saying, okay, you're allowed to protest, but maybe, you know, you have to do it in this particular, in a certain way, right? And they demonstrated that they could do that last year at the Black Lives Matter march. That was illegal too. It had far more than were allowed to gather at the time, but it was relatively peaceful. Yeah.
yeah, so just like on protests and stuff, so a lot of the interactions you saw between the police and the public were under the toe directives, which were enforceable because of the state of emergency. Now we're going into a period of time where we have this permanent pandemic legislation that's being, as some have termed it, being shoved through the lower house in some very quick fashion in a few days. Now, what does that change? What is this permanent pandemic legislation, like the requirement for it, and how will that change things? Is it worse than what we have, or is it better? Like what's going on with this permanent pandemic legislation?
Look, you know, we've only officially had access to it for a few hours. Now, it's not going to be, I'd like to stress that it's not going to get debated in the upper house, my house, this week, or at least I hope it's not going to be. Our expectation is that it will come up in a few weeks' time in November. But look, we've done some analysis of it already, and there's a few things that we see that are very concerning. So one of them is a new criminal provision, and it's basically an aggravated ignoring of directions from of health directions, and this is like where someone intentionally ignores some direction. Now, to my mind, this could be anything. This could be not wearing a mask, or it could be someone, you know, we've seen situations where people that they don't want to organise protests, that at the moment they'll arrest them for incitement and then put them on bail conditions and that sort of thing to keep them under control. You could argue that those people that organised a protest while under one of these pandemic things, they could charge them with this, and it's like a severe criminal penalty, like 2 years jail. So that's alarming, first off. Secondly, some of the things that they got in there that look good on the surface, I've got serious concerns about. So it's like an expert panel, which they're set up, which will have, you know, human rights experts and medical experts. And on the surface, that sounds like a good idea, right? But they don't actually have any power, and they're selected by the government. So, you know, you question, you know, I've said many times I've been disappointed with many of the institutions that are meant to defend human rights in Victoria and how they've performed. And I'm not convinced that someone that's appointed by the government is going to perform better, basically. And they don't have any power to stop anything. They could maybe make some noise, I suppose. The other thing is they've been saying in the media and stuff, oh, it's just like New South Wales, you can, you know, extend it as long as you want. And that is similar, that you can extend. New South Wales doesn't have a limitation on how long you can use it. You have to extend it in chunks. But some other jurisdictions do have like a parliamentary oversight committee made up of members of parliament that will oversee what's happening.
Yeah.
There's
And is
nothing
that is that bipartisan? Is that members from different
yeah, that's
parties?
a bipartisan thing.
Yeah.
And so that would have been a good thing. That's not actually happening. And the other problem is that, like, the only way that you can sort of disallow any of the emergency measures is if there's an existing committee called the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee, which scrutinises acts and regulations. But one of the things that they would have the power to do under this new legislation is to say that, you know, a particular direction was overreach, and then Parliament would have the ability to disallow it, but only if that committee recommended it. Which that committee is, you know, it is bipartisan, but it's effectively controlled by the government. So again, you don't really have any way for Parliament to disallow some of these directions. And another really concerning thing in the legislation is that restrictions or conditions can be imposed on groups, and including groups that are outlined in the Equal Opportunity Act. So this is things like, you know, races, religion, gender, sexuality, and most alarmingly, your political beliefs. So, you know, like, why couldn't they say, well, these people with these political beliefs, we're going to place special restrictions on them, and that would be possible under this legislation, which that in itself is quite alarming. Now, whatever their intentions may have been with this, you know, maybe they've got good intentions, but you have to consider that this, you know, how this type of legislation might be used and how it's permanent legislation, right? So, like, every future government, you've got to trust that they're going to use with those good intentions, and I don't trust that, you know, every future government is going to have this power and use it responsibly. I'm not convinced that this government should have this power and would be able to use it responsibly. You know, and then you've got to question that, you know, our vaccination rate is so high now, much higher than other countries that have, like, almost fully opened up. And you have to question, why do you need this power? I mean, the Premier said, we're not going to be doing more lockdowns. Okay, great. So I don't want to do lockdowns either. So why do you need the power to do lockdowns, right? And they've been talking about this vaccine passport, you know, to segregate society. And, you know, they've said they want to do this through to, you know, end of next year, which I just think is a devastating thing for our society.
Yeah, well, I read today that even Scott Morrison was saying that it should be scrapped and we should be doing what New South Wales is doing. I mean, there's a disconnect between what's happening around the rest of the country and what's happening in Victoria. Why are Victorians being put through this? Because it feels like rest of Australia is not really being put through this kind of pressure on, you know, the fabric of the community. The well-being of the community is not being put under pressure like this.
I just think it's totally unnecessary. I mean, a lot of these, you know, especially with the mandates to keep your job. I mean, we this morning, to keep safety, we actually had a doctor come this morning and do a rapid antigen test. And I think these tests are about $20 each, and they're apparently cheaper if you buy them in large quantities. And this takes 15 minutes. So, you know, if you're concerned about COVID getting into your workplace and the safety of your employees, which is a totally legitimate concern for any employer, they don't want their employees getting sick. You know, you can do one of these a couple of times a week, like we did today. It's very easy. I did it this morning. You just have a cotton bud, goes 5 times around each nostril. A doctor did it to me, but you could do it yourself. And then you put it in a reagent, and then you drip it on here, and it's just like a pregnancy test. Basically, it's got a control line and a test line, and if there's any colour on the test line, then you're positive. But yeah, I'm negative, and Catherine and Tim are negative. And so, you know, this is a really easy and simple way to show that you're not infectious. And so why do you need to lose your job when you can do this? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and plenty of, like, large organizations already are doing these tests. Despite the workforce being mandated to have the vaccine, they're still doing these tests. So it's almost like this is a higher standard for those workplaces before allowing their workers to come in, because it just means that they know for sure that it's because without getting too much into this whole transmissibility of the virus, whether you're vaccinated or not, if this is the only thing that can kind of tell a workplace conclusively at that time whether that person most likely doesn't have the virus when they enter the workplace, is that?
Yeah, I mean, like as you say, and is well recognised, you can still contract and transmit the virus even if you're vaccinated, right? There's a lower probability of that, but you can still contract and transmit it. So if you really need to keep it out of your workplace, something like this, I was told by the doctor today, I've got a certificate that he wrote for me, says that there's 98% accuracy on this. So, 98% probability that I am totally free of COVID. That's a very high standard of efficacy and very low, not very intrusive. It's less intrusive than I've had PCR tests as well. They're a bit more intrusive because they have to stick it way up your nose. This one you don't have to do that. It's just around here. But my understanding is there's other ones that just use saliva, so they're even less intrusive. And if you're really determined to keep COVID out of your workplace, then this seems like a good solution. And as they mass produce these things, costs will go down.
Yeah, I think it's going to be available from November in like Coles and Woolworths for the general public to purchase as well. So if you're a member of the general public who is really kind of concerned about their safety, you could potentially check yourself at home if you wanted to be really sure, before you go out. And just on that, we've seen that for a period of time anyway, at least till we reach a rate of 90%, that unvaccinated and vaccinated people can shop together in retail spaces. To me, it sounds a bit ludicrous that we have all these kind of different settings, and then we're waiting till we have people at 90% vaccination rate, our community, before we tell people again that actually you can't come back to these shops. But right now, when our vaccination rate is lower, you're letting people mingle in these spaces. Like, what's going on? What's with all these kind of? It feels strange. All of that,
I don't think this has anything to do with science. I think it's about legality. On the 24th of November, they'll have their new pandemic legislation. So there's actually a Supreme Court challenge to the mandates at the moment under the current legislation, under the current emergency powers. I don't know. I'm speculating, but maybe they're worried about the legality of what they're doing now, and on the 24th of November, they won't be worried about the legality. I think that's what it comes down to. I don't know. Like, I can't see any scientific explanation for this whatsoever. It doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't make any sense. Because by that time, like you say, you've got a higher vaccination rate, so you're
more protected.
So your probability of transmitting the virus in that period should be higher than it would be after, right? But that's the one thing that will be different between now and then, will be that they think that they'll have this pandemic legislation.
And with this pandemic legislation, we've heard Daniel Andrews come out and say that there won't be any kind of statewide lockdowns again. He's said that at one of his press conferences. But this legislation kind of points to the fact that potentially, at a drop of a, he could just, even if there's a case overseas somewhere of some new variant, potentially he could lock down the state. Do you see lockdowns in the future of Victoria? Or is it really just hard to kind of speculate on something like that?
The only way we're going to guarantee we don't have lockdowns is if the government doesn't have the power to do lockdowns.
In the manner in which they can do it.
Yeah, it's I'm not even convinced that lockdowns are particularly effective. I mean, we've seen very high transmission rates during the last lockdown. So, if lockdowns were going to stop transmission, if their objective was to stop transmission, they clearly didn't achieve that objective. We saw early last year, I think we sort of fooled ourselves into thinking lockdowns work because we did squash it with lockdowns, but we've seen recently that hasn't worked. And so you have to question, does locking people inside for long periods of time and taking them out of school, taking them out of their workplaces, is that a sensible thing to do? And I've never really understood why they had limitations on, how long you could spend outdoors. I mean, outdoors seems like the safest place you could be.
Well, now it's all about being outdoors.
Well, that's what it should have been all
they're
along,
saying the
maybe.
retail, like, I saw some videos of Kmart and stuff selling stuff from like out the front of their store. I was in the city, I saw a shoe shop had their shoe racks outside. So all of a sudden now everything's, outdoors is much safer. But before, like you said, we were locked indoors and said limited time outdoors. Is a lot of this for people that aren't really paying attention to all the science and all this stuff that's going on with this. A lot of it would be confusing. Like it
doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense, right? A lot of it's confusing.
and it's a very one-dimensional way of looking at things, right? Because health is a holistic thing, right? And saying, well, we just need to get the case numbers down and we lock everyone inside. Well, that's bad for your physical health because you're not getting out, you're not doing exercise. Like so many people have put on weight, they joke about it, COVID-19 kilos, right? And it's not good for kids to not, see their friends and play sports and be involved with their clubs. It's not good for your mental health. Like there's so many negative effects. And, I haven't seen a good justification that says that, the benefits outweigh the negatives. And in fact, I think the benefits in many ways are really questionable, especially when you're stopping people going outdoors, which for any transmission of disease should be one of the safest places to be if you're out in the fresh air and the sunshine.
It's one of the final questions I have is for members of the public who are concerned about everything that's going on. What can they do? Should they be reaching out to their MPs? Is there particular MPs they should be reaching out into, especially in the upper house? Does that make a difference? Because you've almost got this system where the government's taken 3 of the people from the Legislative Council as a part of this. It looks like to put all this together. Do they only really need those 3 people's votes to push this through? Like, is there any way that this would kind of be amended or changed or stopped? Is there hope?
Look, in terms of stopping it, I think it's look, people are already reaching out to members of parliament. I've literally got thousands of emails in my inbox that we're going through at the moment. And, I really appreciate the people that have contacted me and supported me and have provided their views. And, we try and respond to all of them. And so if you sent me an email, I haven't responded yet, we will do our best. It might have to be a not personal response because there's such a large number of them. But the volume does give some indication of community sentiment, especially when they're not form ones, when they're actually individual emails from people telling their stories. But I think talk to other people as well, like not just the government, not just members of parliament. Talk to organisations that are meant if you belong to an organisation, make your views known about this. That at least register that you're not happy about it. That it shouldn't be a requirement for this. And look, I feel that honest conversations about this are sort of suppressed a lot as well. Like I know a lot of employers don't want to do this to their staff, right? That they feel cornered, that they have to make a decision between mandating it for their employees or going out of business. And I'm very sympathetic to those employers, faced with such a terrible decision because they have valued employees that they might have to get rid of. And some of them have gone out of business. Like they've just chosen to go out of business. I've seen, bakeries and other businesses that have just said, look, I just can't replace these staff. I can't force them to do things. We can't operate, so we're winding it up. And it's like, wow, it's heavy stuff. But yeah, I mean, I can't advise people to protest and stuff like that because, you're not allowed to do mass gatherings and all that sort of thing.
Well, I heard on the radio like the other day, even Neil Mitchell from 3AW, he was saying if this doesn't bring people to the streets, I don't know what will. So all these kind of, even these media personalities and stuff like this, they've kind of changed their tune. All of a sudden, it's about, you're hearing terms like dictator and dictator dad and all this kind of stuff. Like where have these voices been over the the preceding 20 months, where when a lot of people are actually saying that this is kind of the path we're heading down? Is it too late now that we're taking action, because you have the opposition really voicing their anger about all this stuff that's happened and the way the government's acting? But this is my opinion, I felt like a lot of the times they've just kind of let things pass and let the Labour Party and Daniel Andrews kind of have their way. And now it's come to this very kind of serious pandemic legislation, permanent legislation that can potentially impact, like you're talking before about arresting people or detaining people based on characteristics. And we don't know where they're going to be detained, and for what reason, right? Even someone like myself who's doing the type of work that I'm doing, I've had police visiting my house to tell me to stop.
Yeah,
like in the
I've
future,
seen
can they detain me and take me away somewhere? Like how do these things work? But it's only now that we're having other types of opposition. I know the Liberal Democrats have always spoken out against this, but why has it taken it to this point where it's almost government and Daniel Andrews has the upper hand? The community's got their freedom. Things are kind of going back to normal. Not many people are engaged in this potentially. Why has it taken till now for people to raise their voices and be alarmed at what's happening in our state?
Look, I think there's a lot of people asking questions. Why do we need more power? Like, they've seen the exercise of power, right, over the last 2 years, and you have to look at the context that we're in right now. So the context, like you and I are talking in a basement in a nightclub because members of parliament have been expelled by the government. Now have a think about that. Like, this is the first time in Australian history that I'm aware of that people have been expelled, not because they've committed a crime, not because they've done something dodgy or whatever, not because they've been misbehaving in Parliament. That people get kicked out of Parliament all the time for that. They say something nasty or whatever, and they get asked to leave. We've been kicked out because we didn't hand over our papers. Like, you got to think, like, where's this leading? And then you've witnessed it more than anyone. The response from the police force to people wanting to exercise their right to peaceful assembly. You've seen when you have independent journalists who want to cover these things, and to my mind, anyone should be able to be an independent journalist, right? They should be able to have the right to go and cover these things. How they've had police come to their door, and they're scared. We've seen people who try to organise protests, even if they're trying to do it in the safest manner that they can. They get arrested for incitement and they get these bail conditions on them.
Well, it's amazing, like in Australia, when you think about it, that protests are being organised through encrypted apps. That's what you do in countries where there's regimes that would crack down on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, or drug dealers and
drug
stuff like
dealers,
that,
right?
Yeah.
People like
organised
everyday
crime.
everyday ordinary, good Australians that having issues with their government have had to use encrypted messaging apps to organize these things, because if they do it publicly, which is normally how we would voice our dissent and organize these things, they would potentially be taken out for incitement. This is unprecedented in a country like Australia, and these new pandemic legislation, I feel like that would only further solidify the government's ability to shut down this kind of dissent in the future.
I think that there's been people maybe waking up to the idea that there's these competing philosophies here, right? There's the philosophy of the government is this idea that, the people can't be trusted to manage things themselves. They can't manage their own risk, and everything needs to be done from a top-down manner, right? And people are silly and need to be controlled, and that's this thinking that they've got, this authoritarian mindset, right? And then I've got the opposite mindset to that, the libertarian mindset, which is that people should be able to make their own decisions about things, and that people will make, if they're given good information and they're given opportunities, they will make sensible decisions. And we've even seen, like, in some of these places that have opened up, like in the north of Victoria, when they've read on the news that there's been an outbreak or something in whatever area, people will voluntarily decide to not go to shops in that area, or they'll voluntarily decide to stay home, or these sort of things. And they totally discount the idea that people can voluntarily make these sort of decisions if they're given good information. And I think that should be the role of the government, is to facilitate good decision making rather than this top-down thing, which is always going to be a very, very blunt instrument. Like they have to do these like density limits and all these sort of things in businesses. But if they just gave businesses, I think, really good information, here are all the different risks, because businesses manage risk. I'm sure you manage risk, right, in your own business. Yeah. Every business that manages risk, they have to manage, financial risk, security risk, health risk, worker safety and intellectual property risk, all these different types of risks. And if the government said, okay, here's a new set of risks that we see with this disease, here's some of the risks, and here's some ways that you can address those risks in your business, and some methods and tools and things that you can use to help address those risks, I think that businesses and individuals would respond positively to that. And other countries, they've done this. This is not like some radical thinking. I keep bringing up Japan because I know that they did a lot of this. And very early on, what they did is big education campaigns with offices, right? Because they identified early on that enclosed spaces are probably one of the most dangerous places to transmit the virus. And so what they did is they had a big education campaign saying, in offices, if you can open the window, you should open the window so you get airflow. If you're having a meeting, you leave the door open. Go to the supermarket and buy some of those cheap fans, and then put them in doorways and track the airflow throughout your office and make sure the airflow is going, and switch your air conditioner so it's not recirculating air, and these sort of simple things to lower risk within an office environment. And they said, they educated about masks. They said, in these sort of situations, masks are helpful, and in other situations, masks aren't helpful. And, they basically said, if you're in close proximity to someone in an indoor area, a mask might be helpful on public transport, but in an outdoor setting, it's probably not so helpful. And they allowed people to they never had any fines or anything like that. And most businesses responded. They were like, okay, well, that's not going to cost a lot of money. We can reorganize it. And they said, increase the separation of your workers, put the desks further apart, whatever you can do. And if you've got 2 doors in a meeting area, leave the doors open when you have the meeting. If you've only got 1 door, then you can get recirculation fans, and they even listed where you can buy them in different models and stuff. And they were very cheap, so most businesses could easily afford them. And these are really simple, basic measures. But I mean,
yeah. So it's been more educational, whereas
it's been education.
In Australia, it's been more of I would say, a campaign of fear.
Fear and compliance.
Fear and compliance, right?
Like masks, people don't wear. Australians don't use masks effectively. I mean, they're a classic thing. They wear it so they don't get a fine, right? That's why everyone wears a mask. And, but actually mask usage, like there's education in how to wear a mask properly, and what it can and can't do, and all those sorts of things, and what it protects against and what it doesn't protect against. But no one really thinks, you see people, they'll take it off and they'll touch the outside of it. If it was actually protecting anything, then you've got it all over you, right? It's people just do it so they don't get a fine.
Yeah, I mean, the classic one is everyone just kind of gets a drink so they can walk around with their mask.
The compliance drink.
The compliance drink, which the one that when I saw that happening, I knew that there's something else going on here. It's not all health related.
There's this woman who was walking past my office every day, and she was carrying this pet bottle, and every day she walked past with this pet bottle. I was thinking, why is she doing? That's probably why she's doing it. Like she's drinking.
Perfect. Well, David, thank you for having a chat with me about all that stuff that's happening from the Parliament in Exile here at Chase Lounge. Hopefully this is not a permanent thing, and you can.
I hope next time I come here that there'll be dancing and music and people buying alcohol. So the bar's closed.
I was going to say, like, you guys have pretty much killed the vibe of the nightclub by bringing politicians in here.
Yeah, we're pretty
the last
daggy,
thing that a club would want to be known for.
But it's still cool. But it's less cool with us, I suppose. But it's more cool than being empty and dark. So, yeah.
Awesome. And yeah, thank you again, David. Thank you again for the chat.
Yeah, thanks.